In July 1845, two ships approached the Canadian Archipelago in search of the elusive Northwest Passage. They passed two whale ships as they moved further inland, and that was the last time they were ever seen or heard from. The fate of the journey was shrouded in mystery for the next century, but over time, the sickening truth was revealed. This is the story of the fateful Franklin expedition. In May 1843, a 57-year-old British naval captain named John Franklin sat outside his brick country home in Lincolnshire, England. It was a fine home, comfortable, with plenty of space for when his daughter Eleanor brought his two grandchildren over for a visit. There was a cobblestone patio that led into a spacious, lush backyard with green grass and colorful garden beds. The sun shone down and butterflies fluttered about, but John's mood did not match the light of this beautiful day. He stared off into space, a defeated man. Franklin had joined the Navy when he was just 14 years old with his lifelong friend Matthew Flinders. His mix of kindness and brutal honesty endeared him to his superiors, and he quickly rose through the ranks. He explored Australia in 1801, served in the battles of Trafalgar and New Orleans, and even commanded his own ship in an Arctic expedition in 1818 when he was just 32 years old. On that mission, he conducted a detailed exploration of Hudson's Bay, and then upon his return, he published a book of his findings, and his superiors were so impressed with the work that they awarded him a second Arctic expedition. In 1825, Franklin led this expedition to the same area. Eager to save resources and impress his supervisors, Franklin grossly underestimated the amount of food needed for the journey. One of his ships became trapped in ice and half his crew died of starvation. Those who did make it back to England resorted to eating leather and moss to stay alive. Upon returning home, Franklin was disgraced. His higher officers lost all confidence in him, and he became known as the man who ate his boots. He was demoted to menial administrative posts over the next 20 years, and there he withered away. John was a sensitive man, keenly influenced by the opinions of others. Such a lowly standing amongst the public tore him up inside. He was ashamed to even leave his home for a short walk with his wife Jane. Jane was perhaps the worst of this situation. While she never came out and said it, John could tell that she had slowly lost respect for him over the years. She no longer trusted him as a provider and a protector. She spoke to him in an abrasive, harsh tone that was non-existent when they first married. They hadn't been intimate in years. And so, John lived out his days in a pool of self-pity, helpless to change his situation. He figured he would work a few more years in his clerical position and then retire and spend more time with his daughter and grandsons. They were the only light in his life. "John!" Jane's high-pitched voice startled him out of his trance. "There's a letter for you." John received a lot of letters, usually work-related, but he would occasionally hear from his old Navy buddies, and he hoped this was the latter. John stood up and slowly wandered into the kitchen. He saw the letter sitting there on the counter, and with a sinking feeling in his stomach, he realized it was from the Navy. No doubt it was another menial task well below his experience and pay grade. John braced himself and tore open the top of the envelope. He scanned through several dense paragraphs of text, much more than he had expected, and his eyes began to light up as he realized that this was the golden opportunity that he'd been waiting for the past 20 years. The 20th century was a time of great change. The steam engine had recently been invented and nearly every corner of the world had been mapped. One big gap was the Northwest Passage. The world still didn't have the resources to undertake a project like the Panama Canal, and without it, or a documented Northwest Passage, ships had to travel around the tip of South America, which was not very efficient at all. 81-year-old Sir John Barrow, second Secretary of the British Admiralty, saw the elusive Northwest Passage as a golden opportunity to put one last feather in his cap before retirement. He ordered a final Arctic expedition and began the lengthy search for a man to lead this journey. William Edward Parry had an impressive resume. In 1827, he set the world record for the northernmost point reached, one that wasn't broken until 1875. He completed 4 more expeditions over the course of his 50-year-long naval career, but when approached by Barrow, he simply stated that he was tired of the Arctic. Then came James Clark Ross, perhaps the most respected Arctic explorer in all England. He had led 5 expeditions, and prior to 1845, he commanded the HMS Erebus, which had already been selected as one of the 2 ships for this new excursion. He was a natural fit and actually showed some interest early on, but his wife eventually convinced him not to accept. Barrow's third choice was James Fitzjames. Fitzjames was just 31 years old at the time, but he had already accomplished a lot in his short career. He joined the Navy at 12 and had distinguished himself with incredible bravery during the Egyptian-Ottoman War. He was also close friends with Barrow's son George, and that connection is probably the only reason he was actually seriously considered. Eventually, it was decided that he just didn't have enough experience to lead such an arduous mission. The fourth choice was a man named Francis Crozier, who was a good friend of James Clark Ross. Crozier had completed 6 of his own Arctic expeditions, and on paper, he was a great choice. He had tons of experience, but there was one problem. He was Irish and came from a very poor family. The Admiralty had full faith in Crozier as a commander, but they didn't want an Irishman to be the one who discovered the elusive Northwest Passage. They wanted that right to be reserved by an Englishman. As Franklin read his letter from the Navy, it didn't mention that he was actually the 5th choice to lead the expedition, but that was the truth. He was not a bad captain by any means. He'd risen through the ranks of the Navy and led 2 Arctic expeditions, but the last one had left a stain on his legacy. Despite this, he was well liked by his men, known as a kind, caring, and deeply religious person. He was eager to make up for his past, and this expedition seemed like the perfect opportunity. And so it was decided. Franklin would lead the expedition of 2 ships, Crozier would serve as second in command, running the HMS Terror, and Fitzjames would lead the HMS Erebus. Both vessels were cutting-edge technology at the time. The Erebus was a converted bomb vessel. She was 105 feet long and had actually been used in one of James Ross's previous Arctic expeditions. Bomb vessels were particularly good choices for Arctic exploration because they had extra bracing which protected against ice damage. The HMS Terror was a little bit older, but it had been recently renovated and was just as technologically advanced as the Erebus. Interestingly enough, the Terror had actually taken part in the bombardment of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, where Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Both ships had a steam engine connected to a propeller, making them the first vessels in the British Navy to be powered this way. Each engine was 25 horsepower and could move the ships at a speed of 4 knots. The steam from the engines was also distributed through the ship in a network of pipes, creating one of the first central heating systems. Desalination machines on board converted seawater to fresh, which powered the engines and also offered ample drinking water for the men. Finally, the thickness of the hulls was doubled for more structural integrity. In addition to the impressive technology on board, each ship carried 8,000 cans of preserved food, which was a relatively new invention at the time. The food would comfortably last for 3 years and could be extended to up to 5 years with strict rationing. And so, on the 19th of May, 1845, the 2 ships and 129 crew members left Greenheath, Kent. They traveled around the northern tip of Scotland, crossed the Atlantic before making a stop in Greenland. There, they offloaded 5 men who had become too ill to continue the journey. After leaving Greenland, they were seen by 2 whaling ships in Baffin Bay on July 29, 1845. This was the last time they were ever seen by Europeans. On Arctic voyages at the time, it was typical to sail through the warm months and then dock for the winter as the ocean ice sealed. These wooden boats weren't capable of cutting through ice like today's vessels. So the ships sailed through the frigid waters until their first winter, where they found a protective cove near Beechey Island. They pulled a cloth canopy over top the deck and packed snow against the ship's hull for insulation. The men's spirits were very high during that first winter. They'd made great progress and rations were plentiful. They spent most of their time hunting seals on the mainland of Beechey Island and reading on board. 3 men died during this first winter, which was unfortunate, but a small amount of attrition on these types of expeditions was to be expected, so the rest of the men weren't too alarmed. The spring thaw released the ships from the ice and they continued on their journey. In July 1846, Franklin had a decision to make. They sat at the northern point of King William Inlet, a landmass that wasn't fully mapped yet. The inlet is actually an island, but the men didn't know this at that time. They could either head south around the inlet and hope that they didn't hit land at the bottom, or head west. Heading west would keep them away from land for sure, but it would also lead into a particularly icy section of ocean. South would have been a safer choice, but Franklin just couldn't risk holding up the expedition, so he made the decision to go west and didn't think much of it. This decision would prove to be fateful. The ships became stuck in the ice off the coast of King William Island on the 12th of September 1846. This was not part of the plan. Franklin hadn't expected to be stuck until November. With no choice, they prepared for another winter. That winter would be their undoing. Modern ice samples have shown that the winters of 1846 and a few years after were some of the harshest in the last several hundred years. The ice didn't thaw in the spring of 1847 as Franklin had expected. In April of that year, a group of 8 men traveled on foot to King William Island. They erected a cairn, a pillar of small stones, and placed a note inside. The note simply stated the ship's locations, that Franklin was in command, and that all is well. Things only got worse from there. 2 weeks after the party of 8 returned to the ship, Sir John Franklin died. We don't know the specifics of his death, but some type of illness would be a safe assumption. Crozier took over command of the expedition. Through 1847 and into 1848, the ships still didn't thaw. The men were running low on supplies and the situation was becoming dire. With little chance of being freed from the ice, Crozier made the decision to abandon the ships on the 22nd of April, 1848. The now 105 men loaded their equipment and supplies onto sledges and began walking south across King William Island. Their goal was to reach a Canadian trading post 800 miles away. On the 25th of April, they reached the cairn where the party of 8 had left a note the previous year. They updated it with a new note that painted a far darker picture. HMS ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has to this date been 9 officers and 15 men. The group left the cairn and continued south. Things only got worse. Men began dropping dead for unexplainable reasons. They were still reasonably well fed at this point, but they would often complain of mysterious muscle and joint pains before collapsing into the snow. The records documenting these deaths were puzzling until an investigation in the 1980s, where it was discovered that the men were almost certainly suffering from lead poisoning. The company that was awarded the contract to create 16,000 cans of preserved food had just 7 weeks to complete the work before the voyage was set to take off. This wasn't nearly enough time, so they rushed the canning process, and in doing so, lead solder leaked into the cans, which poisoned the men. Besides that, many began to suffer from scurvy. After 3 years at sea, the lemon juice that had been brought to prevent this situation was losing its potency. As the poison canned reserves ran low, the men became desperately hungry. They were pulling 8,000-pound sleds in the freezing cold while weak from malnutrition. When a man collapsed from exhaustion, he was thrown into the sled, making it even more difficult to pull. Eventually, the group of weak men were left in a tent with some food and a promise that the others would return once they had reached civilization. But that return never came. Inuit eyewitnesses claim that they saw a group of around 100 men set out in 1848. By 1850, the group was down to just 40 men, and by 1851, just 4 men were spotted heading south. The Inuit also found an abandoned ship in 1850 that matched the description of the HMS Erebus, with several dead men in their bunks and a fire still burning. This means that a few men must have returned or remained on the ship. Now, like me, you're probably wondering, if the Inuit saw these struggling men, why didn't they help them? They did, after all, live full-time on King William Island and would have had enough knowledge to save lives. Historian Dorothy Eber suspects that the Inuit likely came across the sailors in the last days of their lives when they'd already lost their minds to hunger, scurvy, and lead poisoning. The Inuit had never seen Europeans at this point, so they were likely terrified of this group that, at this point, would have resembled zombies. One account claims that the Inuit actually did help a group of sailors, but the white men were suspicious of them and rejected their offers of food and trade. The Inuit nonetheless built them an igloo, started a fire, and left them with seals to eat before leaving them alone. We'll never know all of the details of these interactions, but it's interesting to surmise. Extreme hunger will push a man to do things he would never otherwise consider. As the journey south continued, the men of the expedition became consumed with a hunger-fueled insanity. The Inuit began witnessing horrific things. They claimed they saw crew members butchering, cooking, and eating their fallen comrades. When these claims reached the Admiralty, they were brushed off. Barrow in particular felt that the Inuit were liars, and British men would never do something so savage. And so, the rumors were kept hidden for the next 100 years, until autopsies showed cut marks on the men's bones. Perhaps an even more disturbing eyewitness account happened much later. In the 1870s, the Inuit claimed they had witnessed a European man whose description matched Captain Crozier walking south in 1858. The thought of Francis Crozier wandering the Arctic alone 10 years after abandoning ship is absolutely horrifying. But the testimony came far too late, and on the 31st of March 1854, the Admiralty declared every single man on the expedition dead. The investigation remained stagnant until the autopsies, which happened in the 1980s. In 2014, during a diving expedition, the HMS Erebus was found in Wilmot and Crampton Bay. It was sitting in 36 feet of water and was in pretty bad shape. Then in 2016, the Terror was ironically found in Terror Bay. It was in much better condition, and several missions since have retrieved artifacts that shed more light into the fate of those men. The failed Franklin expedition is a sobering reminder of how seemingly small, insignificant decisions can have huge consequences. Captain Franklin probably didn't think much of his decision to head west around King William Island. It was a routine situation he'd faced hundreds of times before in his long naval career, but that fateful choice cost the lives of 129 men and led to unspeakable horrors. Much of the terror of this expedition is still shrouded in mystery, and it will likely stay this way for eternity. But it does show us that even the most civilized people can be pushed to do horrific things when faced with a life and death situation. Thanks for listening.